This is a story that challenges everything we know about justice, faith, and miracles. The protagonist was not a saint. He was a man who had committed terrible mistakes. But what happened in his final hours would prove that the mercy of the Virgin Mary knows no limits. Prepare yourself to witness one of the most remarkable miracles ever documented inside a prison. A story that changed not only the life of a condemned man, but also forever transformed the faith of everyone who witnessed the impossible. Before we go on, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what team it is right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. The fluorescent lights of Florence Federal Correctional Complex hummed quietly above Karim Al-Hassan's cell, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. To most guards, he was just another man on death row, a Muslim immigrant whose life had spiraled into violence and tragedy. But to the people who truly knew him, the story was far more complicated. His mother, Amina, had spent years praying outside these walls, clutching a worn image of the Virgin Mary, Maryam, a symbol of hope she believed transcended religions. In the control room, veteran guard Luke Henderson watched Karim through the monitor. Henderson had seen hardened criminals break, lash out, scream at the world. But Karim was different tonight. He sat upright, hands folded, eyes fixed on the small image of Maryam his mother had brought during her last visit. No anger, no fear, only a strange, unsettling peace. Down the hall, Father Samuel Brooks, the prison chaplain, whispered a quiet prayer. He had walked with countless inmates in their final moments. Yet something about this case troubled him deeply. There is truth buried somewhere in this man's story, he murmured, a conviction he couldn't explain. And as dawn approached, nurses, guards, and administrative staff moved through the prison with an unusual heaviness. None of them could articulate why. They only sensed that something was coming, something none of them were prepared to understand. By sundown, the final request of a Muslim man would shake an entire institution, bridge two faiths, and reveal a miracle no one could deny. From the outside, Karim Al-Hassan's childhood looked ordinary, a quiet neighborhood in Dearborn, Michigan, a small brick home that always smelled of cumin, mint tea, and the warm spices of his mother's cooking. But inside that home lived a woman whose faith carried an entire family. Amina, his mother, prayed 5 times a day, yet held a profound respect for every expression of God's mercy. On a shelf in their living room, beside her Quran, sat something few expected to see in a Muslim household, a small, framed image of Maryam, the Virgin Mary. For Amina, Maryam wasn't just a figure from religious stories. She was the model of purity, obedience, and divine protection. On sleepless nights when Karim was a child, Amina would sit beside him and whisper, "Maryam watches over every child, not just our own people. Whoever calls on her with sincerity will never be abandoned." Those words shaped Karim more than anyone realized. At school, he carried a quiet gentleness. Teachers recalled him helping classmates who were bullied. Neighbors remembered him shoveling snow from elderly porches without being asked. Yet the streets around Dearborn were changing, gangs recruiting younger and younger, promising belonging, power, and quick money. By 13, Karim was caught between two worlds, the peaceful faith of his mother and the dangerous allure of the streets. His father had passed away early, leaving a void he never fully understood. Friends became family, and the rhythm of sirens and arguments outside his window slowly replaced the serenity of Amina's evening prayers. Still, every night, before turning off the lights, Amina would gently kiss the framed image of Maryam and whisper a prayer over her son. She could not stop the storms waiting outside her door, but she believed with all her heart that Maryam could. And though Karim didn't fully grasp it then, That simple image, that symbol of hope across two religions, would become the very thing that saved his life decades later. Inside a cold federal prison where miracles were not supposed to happen. As Karim crossed into his late teens, the quiet warmth of his home could no longer shield him from the growing violence outside. Dearborn's East District was changing fast, unemployment rising, small shops closing, and young men drifting toward the only groups that seemed to offer protection. To Karim, who carried the weight of losing his father and the responsibility of providing for his mother, the world outside offered a dangerous promise: quick cash, brotherhood, and a sense of identity he felt slipping away. At 18, he began running small errands for a neighborhood crew, nothing violent at first. Delivering packages, driving at night, earning money that felt life-changing compared to the struggle at home. His mother worried but could not stop him. Each night, she waited on the couch, whispering prayers of Maryam over the photo frame, hoping her son was safe, hoping he would come home. But the streets don't give without taking. By 23, Karim was deeper in the network than he ever intended, surrounded by men who made their living with weapons and threats. He tried to pull away, but the group had already claimed him. Just one more run, they would say. Just one more job. Then came the night that sealed his fate. A deal went wrong behind an abandoned warehouse outside Detroit. Shots were fired, too fast, too chaotic for anyone to understand. A federal officer fell, and the men scattered into the darkness. Karim was arrested 2 hours later, not with a gun in his hand, but with fear in his eyes. The trial was swift. Headlines painted him as a radicalized Muslim criminal. Prosecutors leaned into stereotypes. His public defender was overworked, unprepared, and intimidated. Evidence was thin, but bias was heavy. A key witness placed Karim at the center of the crime, testimony that would later be exposed as corrupted. When the jury delivered their verdict in less than 5 hours, the courtroom felt colder than any prison cell. Amina collapsed into sobs, clutching her framed image of Maryam as Karim was sentenced to death. Justice had spoken, but justice had been deceived. And deep inside the prison walls, where he would spend the next decade, the groundwork for a miracle had already begun. In the months following the verdict, the corridors of Florence Federal Correctional Complex gained a new, familiar presence. Every 4 weeks, rain, snow, or blistering Colorado heat, Karim Al-Hassan made the long trip from Michigan to visit her son. Her steps were slow, her scarf often trembling in the wind, but her resolve never wavered. Guards began recognizing her before she even reached the metal detectors. Inside the visitation booth, separated by thick glass, Karim tried to hide his shame behind a practiced smile. But Amina saw everything: his exhaustion, his fear, his quiet unraveling. She pressed her hand against the glass, and he mirrored it, never touching, yet desperately connected. On her third visit, she brought something unusual for a Muslim mother entering a federal prison: a small framed image of the Virgin Mary Maryam, wrapped carefully in a scarf. "It came from my Christian friend, long ago," she explained softly. "She told me, Maryam watches over all children. I prayed with this image when you were small, and now I pray with it for you again." The guard hesitated but allowed Karim to keep the frame in his cell after inspection. That moment sparked whispered conversations among staff, some curious, others skeptical, about the Muslim man who kept a Christian icon beside his bed. As the years passed and appeals failed, Amina grew older. Her hair silvered. Her steps weakened. But her faith remained fierce. She would sit outside the prison chapel before each visit, whispering prayers in Arabic. "Maryam, protect my son. Reveal the truth. Do not let him die for the sins of another." Father Samuel Brooks often saw her praying alone and felt a weight in his chest. He had ministered to countless grieving mothers, but something about Amina was different, an unwavering strength wrapped in quiet sorrow. "Your faith humbles me," he once said gently. She simply smiled. When a mother prays, God listens in his own time. Little did anyone know, guards, chaplains, administrators, that the small framed image she carried with such reverence would become the center of one of the most shocking miracles ever witnessed inside a U.S. prison. Life inside Florence Federal hardened most men. But for Karim, the walls did something unexpected. They slowed him down enough to hear the echoes of his past. The chaotic rush of street life faded, replaced by long stretches of silence that forced him to confront who he had become. Each evening, after the final head count, he would sit on his bunk and stare at the framed image of Maryam his mother had given him. It was the only object in his cell that felt alive. The gentle tilt of her head, the softness in her eyes, something about it unsettled him, yet comforted him. He began offering quiet prayers under his breath, unsure if God still listened to men like him. That was when Father Samuel Brooks entered his life more deeply. The elderly chaplain, with his calm voice and worn Bible, visited the death row wing weekly. Unlike others, he didn't try to convert Karim. He didn't pressure, debate, or preach. He simply asked questions. What keeps you awake at night? What do you wish people understood about you? What truth is still buried? For the first time in years, Karim felt seen, not as an inmate, not as a Muslim, not as a criminal, but as a human being. The chaplain noticed the framed image one afternoon and nodded respectfully. "She is honored in your faith as well," he said softly. Karim replied, "My mother says Maryam hears the prayers of every child, even the lost ones." Father Brooks smiled gently. "Then keep praying. Truth has a way of finding men who seek it." Their conversations became a quiet refuge. Guards passing by noticed Karim no longer erupted in anger, no longer paced at night, no longer lashed out at the world. Instead, he read both the Quran and the Bible. He listened. He searched. And in that search, something shifted. The bitterness that once hardened him began to crack. Regret surfaced. Reflection deepened. A strange peace began to settle over him, as though unseen hands were preparing him for something he could not yet name. What no one inside that prison knew was that Karim's transformation was only the beginning. The true miracle was already on its way. It happened on a night when the prison felt colder than usual, one of those nights when silence presses against the concrete walls like a living thing. Karim sat on his bunk with the Quran open and the framed image of Maryam beside it. For weeks, he had been praying in a way he never had before, not out of desperation, but with a strange longing for peace, or truth, or both. As the clock neared 2:40 a.m., a faint brightness touched the corner of his vision. At first he thought it was a guard's flashlight, but when he looked up, the corridor remained dark. The light, impossibly soft and warm, was inside his cell. Then he saw her. A woman, clothed in blue and white, standing in a radiance that didn't cast shadows. Her expression was gentle, almost motherly. Karim froze, not in fear, but in a kind of awe he didn't have words for. His heartbeat slowed. His breath caught. Her voice, if it was a voice at all, felt like a whisper carried by wind and water. "Your mother's prayers have reached heaven. Do not despair. The truth is near." Karim blinked. His eyes watered. And just as quickly as the light appeared, it faded, dissolving into the gray darkness of the cell. He sat motionless for minutes, unsure if he had dreamt it. His hands trembled as he picked up the framed image of Maryam. as though it might now hold a secret only he could see. The next morning, guards walking past noticed something different. Karim wasn't pacing, wasn't staring at the floor with hollow eyes. Instead, he was seated upright, calm, almost luminous in his own quiet way. Officer Luke Henderson later said, "It was like he'd seen something that took the weight off his soul." When Father Samuel Brooks visited that afternoon, Karim finally told someone what he had witnessed. The chaplain listened without blinking, his weathered hands folded gently. "Karim," he said softly, "Our Lady appears to those who are crushed and forgotten or lost. If she came to you, something greater is unfolding." And though neither man could yet imagine what that meant, the encounter marked the moment the impossible became possible. The miracle had begun. 3 weeks after the vision, the sound of metal doors slamming echoed through the death row wing. It was a sound everyone recognized, the arrival of the warden. Warden Mitchell Harper, a stern but fair man who had overseen dozens of executions, paused outside Karim's cell. His presence alone made the other inmates fall silent. Harper opened the viewing slot. "Karim Al-Hassan," he said, in a voice that carried the weight of finality. "The state has scheduled your execution date 72 hours from now." For a moment, Karim didn't move. Not out of shock, but out of a strange, steady acceptance. He nodded slowly. Behind Harper, Officer Henderson watched closely. He expected anger, panic, denial, the reactions he'd seen countless times. But Karim simply placed a hand over the framed image of Maryam on his bunk, as though anchoring himself to the only hope he had left. Later that evening, the customary final meal form was slid under his door, along with a note requesting his last earthly desires. Inmates often asked for extravagant feasts, recordings of favorite songs, or letters to loved ones. Karim wrote only one line: "I request permission to keep the image of Maryam, the Virgin Mary, with me until my final moment." When the warden read the request, his brow furrowed. "This is unusual," he muttered. "A Muslim inmate asking for a Christian icon at his execution." But after consulting with the chaplain and security officers, he approved it. It was harmless, they agreed. Sentimental, nothing more. Harper returned to Karim's cell the next morning. "You sure this is all you want?" Karim nodded. "I don't need a feast. I only need her." Word of the unusual request spread quietly through the prison. Some guards whispered mockingly. Others, especially those who had seen Karim's transformation, felt an uncomfortable pull in their chests, like something greater was unfolding, just beyond the reach of logic. In the chapel, Father Brooks lit a candle for Karim, murmuring, "A prayer." In Michigan, Amina fell to her knees the moment she heard the news. And in the death row wing, the small image of Maryam rested in Karim's hands, waiting for the night that would shake the entire prison to its core. The night before the execution felt unnaturally still. Even the usual sounds, distant coughing, metal clanging, restless pacing, seemed to fade into a heavy silence. Karim sat on his bunk, the framed image of Maryam held gently in both hands. He whispered the same prayer his mother had recited over him since childhood, a prayer that crossed the boundaries of faith and culture. At 3:17 a.m., Officer Luke Henderson began his routine walk down the death row corridor. He moved slowly, checking each cell with a practiced glance. But when he reached cell 42, he stopped mid-step. A faint, golden glow leaked from under Karim's door. At first, he thought it was a smuggled light, maybe a hidden device or a contraband phone. But as he stepped closer, the glow brightened soft, warm, rhythmic, as though alive. Henderson's pulse spiked. He had worked in this wing for 17 years, and had never seen anything like it. He unlocked the viewing slot and peered in. Karim was awake, but frozen in awe. The framed image of Maryam in his hands was glowing, a radiance so gentle it didn't illuminate the concrete walls, but wrapped itself around Karim like a protective mantle. "What the hell?" Henderson whispered under his breath. He radioed urgently. "Control. This is Henderson. I need a supervisor to cell 42. Now." Within minutes, Night Supervisor Rachel O'Neill and 2 guards arrived. One look through the viewing slot left them speechless. O'Neill, normally unshakable, felt chills race down her spine. "There's no bulb, no reflection, no possible source," she murmured. Warden Harper was called at 3:41 a.m. He arrived disheveled, clearly pulled from sleep. Yet, the moment he saw the glowing image, his expression collapsed into disbelief. "Shut down this corridor," he ordered. "No one speaks of this outside." "Not yet." Finally, Father Samuel Brooks was brought in. The moment he saw the glow, the elderly priest fell to his knees, whispering, "Holy Mother, what are you doing here?" Inside the cell, Karim's eyes brimmed with tears, not of fear, but of profound calm. He clutched the image closer, whispering, Thank you for not leaving me." None of them knew it yet, but this was only the first miracle. The second would shatter everything they believed about justice, guilt, and truth. By sunrise, rumors about the glowing image had already traveled through the prison like an electric current. Guards whispered in break rooms. Inmates pressed their ears to their doors. Some mocked it, others feared it. But everyone sensed the same thing. Something supernatural had entered their world. At 9:58 a.m., a man who never showed emotion in 23 years of service walked down the death row corridor. Senior Officer David Rourke. He was known as a hardliner, a man who believed mercy was weakness, a man who had once bragged he could smell guilt on a prisoner from 20 feet away. Yet today, as he approached Karim's cell, his steps faltered. He had heard about the glow. They dealt percent. He told himself it was nonsense. Tricks. Hysteria. But when he reached the door and looked through the viewing slot, his entire body locked in place. The framed image of Maryam lay in Karim's hands, no longer glowing, but still carrying a strange presence, like a silent witness. And Karim looked peaceful. Too peaceful for a man with hours left to live. Something inside Rourke cracked. His breathing grew uneven. His hands trembled. And before anyone understood what was happening, the officer fell to his knees on the cold concrete. I can't do this anymore," he choked out, tears streaming down a face that had forgotten how to cry. Warden Harper and 2 guards rushed toward him. "David, what's happening?" Harper demanded. Rourke looked up, eyes red, voice shaking, as though dragged from the deepest part of his soul. "Karim is not guilty." Silence slammed into the corridor. "I lied," he continued, sobbing uncontrollably. "The testimony I gave, it wasn't true. A federal agent forced me to say Karim pulled the trigger. If I refused, he said my family would face consequences. And I was a coward." Karim staggered to his feet inside the cell, gripping the frame tightly. Rourke's confession poured out like a dam, breaking 8 years of guilt, buried under fear, finally ripped open by something he couldn't explain. "I watched his mother cry in court," Rourke whispered. "Every night since then, I've seen her face. I can't carry it anymore. Not after whatever happened last night." Father Brooks closed his eyes, whispering, "Mother Mary, you have touched a hardened heart." Warden Harper's face drained of color. This wasn't just emotion. This wasn't just regret. This was the second miracle, one that would stop an execution and unravel a decade-old injustice. Warden Harper had overseen nearly a dozen executions throughout his career, but never had he witnessed a moment that froze his blood like Rourke's confession. The death row corridor, usually stiff and disciplined, had transformed into a trembling cocoon of disbelief. Guards stood silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum differently. "Get legal on the line," Harper ordered, voice low but urgent. Now, within minutes, a conference call connected the warden, the state attorney, and the federal defense office. Rourke's confession, delivered in front of multiple staff members and recorded on the corridor's security cameras, was enough to initiate an emergency stay of execution. At 11:27 a.m., the order came through. Execution suspended pending investigation. Karim was escorted out of his cell, not in chains as usual, but carefully, respectfully, almost like a man being transferred for protection rather than punishment. Officer Henderson walked beside him, stealing glances at the framed image of Maryam still clutched to Karim's chest. "Did you know?" Henderson whispered. Karim shook his head. "I only prayed for truth." "And truth," the officer murmured, "just punched a hole through every wall in this place." Meanwhile, investigators arrived at the prison to take Rourke's sworn testimony. Sitting at a metal table under harsh fluorescent light, the hardened officer looked shattered, yet strangely relieved. He repeated everything: the federal agent's threats, the fabricated testimony, the suppressed evidence pointing to another suspect. The name he gave, Tariq Trigger Haddad, sent a shockwave through the legal team. Haddad had been a known informant, protected by a corrupt federal agent, and had died 3 years earlier in an unrelated raid. Hidden reports, forgotten files, and buried leads were suddenly dragged back into the light. One investigator whispered to another, "If this is true, we convicted the wrong man 10 years ago." Outside, in the prison chapel, Father Brooks lit a candle with trembling hands. "Mother Mary," he whispered, "you didn't just reveal a miracle. You revealed the truth." For the first time in almost a decade, the trajectory of Karim Al-Hassan's life had shifted. His execution was no longer imminent. His innocence was no longer unthinkable. And the entire system now stood on the edge of a reckoning. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was pressure. Or perhaps, as many in the prison quietly believed, something divine was pushing the truth forward. Within 6 weeks, layers of corruption were peeled open, like a wound finally allowed to breathe. Hidden reports were recovered. Phone records resurfaced. Emails between the corrupt federal agent and the deceased informant were unearthed. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Karim Al-Hassan had been telling the truth from the beginning. On a cold December morning, Karim stood in a small federal courtroom, wrists free of chains for the first time in 10 years. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, making the air feel warmer than the season allowed. Officer Henderson, now transferred to internal affairs, sat quietly in the back row. Father Brooks placed a hand over his heart, and on the other side of the aisle, trembling with anticipation, was Amina. The judge spoke slowly, each word lifting a decade of weight off Karim's shoulders. "All charges are hereby dismissed. Mr. Al-Hassan, you are free to go." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Amina collapsed into tears, whispering prayers in Arabic as she held on to her son. Karim pressed his forehead against hers. The framed image of Maryam clutched between them like a third heartbeat. Outside, reporters swarmed to capture the moment. Headlines spread across the country. Muslim man, exonerated after mysterious prison event. Glowing image, leads to confession. Frees wrongfully convicted inmate. The miracle at Florence Federal. Experts examined the framed image. There was no wiring, no residue, no reflective material, no natural explanation for the light seen by a dozen witnesses. One physicist quietly admitted on camera, "Science cannot explain what happened." Karim didn't claim to understand it either. He only said, with quiet conviction, "Maryam stood with me when the world turned its back." The miracle was no longer confined to a prison cell. It had become national conversation across churches, mosques, courtrooms, and homes about justice, mercy, and the unexpected ways heaven can reach into the darkest places. Freedom did not come to Karim with fanfare or celebration. It came with quiet steps, humility, and a renewed sense of purpose. He settled in a modest apartment near Dearborn, where the Muslim call to prayer echoed softly through the neighborhood and church bells chimed only blocks away. It was the perfect place for a man whose life now stood between two worlds of faith. The first thing he did was create the Maryam Justice Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted inmates, especially minorities and immigrants who rarely had access to strong legal defense. Former guards, public defenders, and even federal investigators reached out, offering help. Among the first to volunteer was Officer Luke Henderson. "If we don't fix the system," he said, "what happened to you will happen again." Inside Karim's home, on a small wooden table draped in a simple white cloth, sat the framed image of Maryam. A soft candle burned beside it each night. Visitors, Muslim, Christian, or neither, often said they felt an unexplainable peace in that corner of the room. Amina lived long enough to see her son rebuild his life. She passed away 2 years later, holding the image of Maryam to her heart, whispering a final prayer for mercy over her beloved child. At her funeral, both a Catholic priest and an imam stood side by side, praying for the same woman. Even in death, she brought people together. Karim often spoke at colleges, prisons, and faith gatherings. His message was simple, yet carried the weight of a miracle witnessed by hardened guards and unbelieving officials. Maryam, the Virgin Mary, came into a prison cell, not for a Muslim or a Christian, but for a son who was forgotten. She broke the walls between two faiths. Today, the story continues to ripple across America, challenging assumptions and healing divisions. It reminds believers everywhere that mercy has no borders, no labels, and no limits. If this miraculous journey touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Touched by Mary for more stories of hope, faith, and the extraordinary power of the Virgin Mary.